The job was straightforward on paper. Restore the load-bearing colonnade on the eastern wing of House Verith's residential complex. Replace 4 cracked pillar bases with poured compact standard structural composite. Realign the lintel assembly overhead and clear out by the end of the 3rd week. 22 days, give or take. Routine civil restoration work. The kind of thing I've done on 47 planets across the corridor. My name is Kale Voss. I am 49 years old. I have been hauling, lifting, mixing, pouring, and bracing structural things since I was 19, 30 years of it. My back has opinions about certain weather systems. My knees have opinions about staircases. My hands, which are the size of small serving plates and about as soft, have opinions about approximately nothing because they stopped registering normal sensation somewhere around year 12. I am not a soldier. I am not a medic. I am not an official of any kind. I hold a Class 4 civil restoration license, a compact structural composite certification, and a single operator heavy placement endorsement. That is the complete list of my formal qualifications. I arrived at the Verith residential complex on the morning of the first day with my equipment pod on a rented skid, my tool case under one arm, and a folded restoration order in my chest pocket. The complex was large, old alien stone in the pale gray gold of the plateau, colonnaded wings extending east and west from a central residential block, garden terraces cut into the slope below the main building. The kind of place that takes 3 generations to build and 3 more to fall into quiet disrepair. The eastern colonnade showed it plainly. 1 pillar base cracked through the core, 3 others showing stress fractures at the footing joint, the lintel assembly above them sitting 12 millimeters out of true. I introduced myself at the service entrance to the household coordinator, a tall Verith woman named Sorith who wore her gray-streaked hair pinned back and had the efficient air of someone who had managed a large building for a long time without anyone noticing how hard that was. She walked me through the eastern wing, pointed out the column work, confirmed I had water and composite access through the service corridor, and told me the household's residential schedule without being asked. The family used the eastern garden terrace on most mornings. I would need to work around that. If I needed to close the colonnade entirely, I was to give her a day's notice. I said that was fine. She looked at me for a moment, the way people sometimes do when they are recalibrating. I am, by human standards, not especially large. By Verith standards, I am apparently somewhat more than not especially large. She said nothing about it. She told me the household included House Verith's 2 daughters, currently in residence, and that I was to treat any requests from house members with appropriate courtesy and otherwise get on with the work. I said I would. She left me to it. I spent the first day on survey, measuring, probing, reading the damage pattern at each footing joint. The cracked base was worse than it looked in the restoration order's photographs. The fracture ran deeper and had propagated horizontally along a seam in the original stone. I was going to need to shore the colonnade section before I could remove the damaged material, which meant 2 days of bracing work before I could even start the composite pour. I revised my schedule accordingly, wrote the note on the back of the restoration order, and got on with setting up the shoring jacks. I work early. I have worked early every day of my professional life, because the best hours for structural composite curing are the cool pre-dawn hours, and the mid-morning before the heat of the day makes the mix impatient. By the second morning, I was at the eastern colonnade at 5:30, bracing jacks in, pillar load transferred, working steadily in the pale pre-dawn light that came off the gas giant above the plateau horizon. I heard them before I saw them. 2 voices, quiet, coming along the garden terrace below the colonnade's eastern end. Young voices, but not children. They had the register of people in their early adult years, the particular kind of quiet that is not trying not to wake anyone but is simply used to speaking at a considered volume in the morning hours. I kept working. They came around the corner of the colonnade and stopped. Two young Verith women, the daughters, I understood immediately. They had the family's characteristic pale gold coloring, the elongated joint structure of the Verith line, the very large dark eyes with their double eyelid that makes Verith expressions difficult to read at a distance but very precise up close. The elder of the two was perhaps 23 by human reckoning, the younger perhaps 20 or 21. They wore light house robes in different shades of gray-green, and they were both carrying small morning cups of something that steamed. They stopped and looked at me. I paused what I was doing, which was operating the torque driver on the lower brace clamp, and inclined my head in acknowledgement. They conferred with each other briefly in low Verith. I do not speak Verith with any fluency, but I have worked on enough Verith-administered projects to recognize the register of people deciding whether something is safe and the register of people deciding something is interesting. These two were somewhere between the two. The elder one spoke to me. Her compact standard was careful and precise and slightly formal, the way it is when it is not the primary language. She said, "I did not know you would be beginning so early." I said, "The composite cures better in cool air. I will be past the noisy portion of this work within the hour. I am sorry for the disruption." She said, "It is not a disruption. We come out early also." They came a little further along the terrace and stood looking at the shoring assembly I had set up against the colonnade. The younger one tilted her head at one of the jacks and asked, with genuine interest, what it was for. I explained, "Load transfer while the damaged base material is removed. The pillar's weight has to go somewhere during the work, so I build a temporary path for it. The jacks take the load from the pillar capital above, hold it through the brace frame, and put it down through the support legs to the terrace floor. The pillar can then be worked on without the load working on it at the same time." The younger one looked at the jack, looked at the pillar, looked at me and said, "How much does it weigh?" I told her. The column load at that point was approximately 4,000 compact standard kilos, distributed across two jacks and a frame assembly. She did the mental arithmetic, which took about 2 seconds, and then looked at the frame again with a different expression. I kept working. They stayed for the better part of an hour standing back from the work area watching. They did not get in the way. They did not ask excessive questions. They watched the way people watch when they are genuinely curious about how something is done, not when they are being polite about it. The younger one asked 2 more questions during that hour, both of them technically specific, both of them good. I answered them. The elder one mostly watched in silence, occasionally speaking in low Verith to her sister. At 6:15, the household coordinator appeared at the far end of the terrace, saw the two of them, and made a small gesture. They gathered their cups and went inside. The younger one paused at the colonnade's doorway and said, clearly and in compact standard so I would hear it, "The load transfer. Is that your own design?" I said, "It is a standard compact civil restoration method, but the specific geometry for this colonnade I calculated myself, yes." She said, "You calculated 4,000 kilo load paths at 5 in the morning." I said, "I calculated them yesterday afternoon. I just set them up at 5 in the morning." She made a sound I could not quite interpret and went inside. I worked. The 3rd and 4th days ran the same way. They came out early, they watched for a time, they asked a question or two, they left when the coordinator arrived. I kept working. On the 4th morning, I had reached the stage where I could begin removing the cracked base material, which involves a hydraulic core drill and a significant amount of noise and dust. I had given Sarth a day's notice as required. She had arranged for the eastern terrace to be closed to household use during the drilling hours, which she communicated to the daughters. They came to the service corridor door instead, which opened onto the work side of the colonnade, and watched through it. The drilling was loud and I was wearing ear protection. I was not wearing the outer work jacket at this point because drilling generates a great deal of heat from friction, and I do not enjoy overheating. I had my work trousers, my reinforced work boots, and a sleeveless underlayer of thick weave, which is what I normally work in during the hot phases of a job. I did not notice them standing at the service corridor door for some time. When I paused the drill to clear the core sample, I heard the younger one say something to her sister in very rapid Varith, and the elder one respond in a sharp undertone that sounded like disagreement with an observation, not with a plan. I pulled my ear protection back and looked at them. The elder one straightened slightly. She said in compact standard, "We apologize. Sarith said the terrace was closed, so we came this way. We will leave." I said, "You are not in the way." There was a pause. The younger one said, in a very careful tone, "What is the material of your covering?" I looked down at the underlayer, which was heavy gray work weave, worn and faded from use. I said, "A thermal weave labor underlayer. Standard issue for high heat work. It keeps sweat moving and protects against debris." She said, "And beneath it?" I said, "Beneath it." She said, "There is more coverage beneath, of the same protective kind." I understood then what she was asking. The underlayer is fitted, and the compact standard cut for heavy work's thermal underlayers is close and functional, which means it follows the line of what is underneath it fairly precisely. What she was seeing, and what her sister had apparently said something about in rapid Varith, was the outline of the musculature beneath the weave. I said, "No, that is not another layer." She said, "Then it is yours." She paused, looking for the word. "Your covering, your natural covering." I said, "That is my natural covering, yes. The shape is my own." She looked at her sister. Her sister said something very quietly in Varith. The elder one said to me, with the directness of someone who has decided to simply ask the question, "If you removed the work garment, what would be underneath?" In Varith measure you appear to have," she paused again, "structural additions, for battle or carrying." I worked out what she meant. I said, "I have neither. I have worked with my hands for 30 years. That is the result." A longer silence. The younger one said, very carefully, "You have no battle covering beneath the work garment." I said, "No, I have never owned a battle covering. I am a construction worker." The elder one said, and her voice had gone very quiet, "Then that." She indicated, with a slight movement of her long fingers, my forearms, which were resting on the drill housing. She said, "That is simply." I said, "Yes." She said, "That is you." I said, "Yes." There was a pause that I would have called stunned if I had been confident I was reading Varith expressions correctly. The younger one sat down, which was not something either of them had done in any of our previous mornings. She sat down on a crate near the corridor door and looked at the floor for a moment, and then looked back at me. I pulled my ear protection back into place and went back to drilling, because the composite cure window was not going to wait for a philosophical conversation about human physiology, and because I found the situation slightly embarrassing in the way that conversations about my physical construction have always made me slightly embarrassed, which is to say, I would rather work. I am aware that I am not a typical example. 30 years of civil heavy works produces a specific kind of body. I am not large in the way of a man who has specifically trained to be large. I am large in the way of a machine that has run the same load cycle for 3 decades and has simply adapted to it. My shoulders are wide because I have spent 30 years carrying things across them. My hands are heavy because I have spent 30 years gripping, turning, and setting things. My arms and back have the density of long, consistent use rather than the shape of deliberate development. I know this. I have simply never cared very much about it in either direction. It is the body I have. It does the work. They came back the next morning, and the morning after that. On the 7th day, which was a rest day for me, I work 6 days and rest the 7th, because the composite needs a full cure cycle before I can assess and continue, and because my knees have very firm opinions about 7-day continuous work. I was in the service courtyard rechecking my supply inventory when the younger daughter found me. She came alone, without the elder sister, without the morning cup. She had clearly come specifically to find me, which was a different thing from happening to come out early and discovering me working. She said, standing in the courtyard doorway, "I have a question." I said, "All right." She said, "On my world, the Verith line has what we call the house guard. They train from the age of 15. 20 years of specific physical training for strength and endurance. They wear protective structural coverings when they are on active duty, because without the coverings they are," she searched for a phrasing, "more easily harmed." I said, "Yes." She said, "How long have you trained?" I said, "I have not trained, I have worked." She said, "What is the difference?" I thought about how to explain it. I said, "Training is preparation for a capacity. Work is the use of a capacity. I did not build my body to be strong. My body became what it is because the work required it and the body adapts. Every load I carry changes something. Over 30 years, those changes compound." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And every person who does what you do." I said, "Not everyone reaches the same result. Some people work less hard. Some people's bodies adapt differently. Some people do lighter work. I have consistently done heavy work for a long time." She said, "But a house guard would not harm you easily." I said, "I am not armored. A house guard with a blade or a weapon would harm me with no difficulty at all." She said, "I am not speaking of a blade." I said, "Then," I considered this carefully, "then a house guard who was relying on physical strength alone would have a different kind of difficulty." She said, "Yes, that is what I meant." We looked at each other for a moment. She was doing something with her expression that I read, slowly, as a form of recalibration, adjusting some internal model of what humans are to account for a piece of data that had not been in the model before. She said, "My name is Vale." I said, "Kale Voss." She said, "I know, it is on the restoration order." She left. I went back to my inventory. On the 8th day, which was the first day of the second work week, I arrived at the colonnade at the usual hour and found the elder daughter already there. She was standing at the shoring assembly with a small light, looking at the torque indicators on the jack heads. She had a notebook in her other hand, and she had been writing something in it. She looked up when I came around the corner. She did not seem surprised to be found there. She said, "Good morning." I said, "Good morning." She said, "The load on the eastern jack is lower than the western jack by approximately 8%. Is that intentional?" I said, "Yes. The damaged base absorbed more load historically from the eastern direction. The fracture pattern tells me that. So I am distributing slightly more of the transferred load to the western jack to avoid putting stress on the damaged material during removal. When the new composite base is in place and cured, I will equalize." She wrote something in the notebook. She said, "My name is Sen." I said, "I know, Vale told me." She said, "She spoke to you." I said, "Yesterday, in the service courtyard." She said, "She is interested in structural mechanics. She has been since she was small." I said, "She asks good questions." Sen looked at the jack assembly for a moment longer and then looked at me. She said, "And you are not concerned by us, asking questions, being here early, watching?" I said, "I am a worker in your house. You are members of the house. This seems like a straightforward arrangement." She said, "Other workers have found it." She paused. "Unusual." I said, "I have worked in palaces before, embassies, diplomatic residences, high-function buildings managed by people who take them seriously. The staff who take buildings seriously are usually also the people who ask better questions about restoration work. I have no objection to either." She looked at me for a moment in the precise Verith way, both eyelids engaged, which I had learned means the full attention is being directed rather than just the surface observation. She said, "Our father is away. He will return in 4 days." I said, "Sarith mentioned that. I will have the composite pour completed before he returns. The cure will still be ongoing, but the active work noise will be done." She said, "That is not why I mentioned it." I waited. She said nothing further for a moment. Then she said, "The household has had visitors in the last 2 weeks before you arrived. They were not from the compact. They presented documentation through a house agent that our father's coordinator has since determined was not authentic." I said, "What kind of visitors?" She said, "The kind who assess households." I kept my face neutral. I said, "Are you telling me this because you want me to know or because you want me to do something?" She said, "I am telling you because you are here and because Vale trusts you, and because the household coordinator is one person and Sarith is good at managing a building, but is not good at managing the kind of problem these visitors represent." I said, "And your father's return?" She said, "Is 4 days, and I believe the visitors will return before he does." I looked at the colonnade. I looked at my equipment pod and the shoring assembly and the restoration schedule I had built carefully over the last week. I said, "How many?" She said, "The first time there were 3, the second time there were 4. They came through the service entrance the second time, which means they have access to the service route information." I said, "Do they know the restoration work is ongoing?" She said, "I do not know what they know." I said, "All right. I am going to need to make some changes to where I store certain equipment." She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "You are not alarmed?" I said, "I am on day 8 of a 22-day job. I am also now on day 8 of a job where 2 household daughters have been coming to ask me questions about load-bearing structures at 5:30 in the morning, which is not how this kind of work usually goes. I have adjusted." She made the sound that I was beginning to understand was the Verith equivalent of a reluctant acknowledgement of something you were not entirely expecting. She said, "What do you need?" I said, "I need the service corridor access point to be locked from the interior during the overnight hours, with a single point of access that I hold. I need to know what time in the day the household is typically quiet, when foot traffic in the eastern wing is minimal. And I need you and Vale to be in the residential block interior, not on the terrace or in the east wing, from the 7th hour through the 10th hour tonight." She said, "You expect them tonight?" I said, "I do not expect anything. I am arranging the work so that if something happens during the night, the work does not stop it. That is what I do. I arrange the work." She said, "The service corridor key." She reached into the pocket of her robe and placed a key on the edge of the shoring frame. It was an old physical mechanism key, heavy and worn, with a Verith house mark pressed into the head. She said, "We have had this since the complex was built. My grandfather made a point of physical locks alongside electronic ones. He said electronic locks have politics. Physical locks have only physics." I said, "Your grandfather understood civil construction." She said he built the east wing himself. Not alone, but he was the foreman. I picked up the key. I said, "Then he would have understood load paths." She said, "He always said the point was to know where the weight was going, not to avoid the weight. To know where it was going." I thought about that. I said, "He was right." She left. I pulled the ear protection back on and went to work. I rearranged my equipment over the course of the day with a purpose that looked, to any outside observer, exactly like a routine site reconfiguration. Equipment pods are moved regularly during restoration work as the job progresses. There is nothing unusual about changing where the hydraulic lines run, or which side of the colonnade the materials staging area occupies, or how the composite mixing station is positioned relative to the work area. I made these changes with the patience of someone who has arranged a work site for 30 years and knows exactly which configuration looks most like ordinary work and occupies the most useful physical positions. I also relocated my personal overnight kit from the equipment pod to the service corridor anteroom, which is not something I would normally do on a residential project. But I had worked remote enough sites in my career to have a kit designed for overnight stays in industrial spaces, and the anteroom had a door that locked with the old physical key, and the anteroom's only window looked directly at the service entrance where Sen had told me the visitors had entered the second time. I ate my evening meal at the work table in the anteroom. I reviewed the next day's pour schedule. I read the structural notes I had made during the week. I turned the light down to a low setting, and I sat in the dark with the window visible and the key in my jacket pocket, and waited to see if I needed to do anything else. They came at the second hour past midnight. There were 5 this time. I saw them through the window, 5 figures in plain, unmarked transit coats, moving in the specific kind of quiet that is not accidental. The lead figure had some kind of device in hand that he was reading as he walked. 2 of them carried cases that were closed and latched. They moved to the service entrance, and the lead figure produced a code device and worked on the lock. I pulled on my work jacket and my boots, picked up the heavy torque wrench from the tool kit, not as a weapon, because I am not a soldier and I do not go looking for that kind of problem, but because it weighs 4 kilos and fit my hand, and if I needed something solid in my hand, it was going to be something I had a professional reason to be carrying. I also picked up the work light from the table, which was on its highest setting and, in an otherwise dark corridor, would function as a very effective way of making 5 people completely unable to see anything for about 15 seconds. The service entrance lock gave after about 90 seconds. The lead figure pushed the door open, and the 5 of them came into the corridor in single file. I turned the work light on. 15 seconds, give or take. In those 15 seconds, I put myself in the doorway of the anteroom, which was the only route to the residential wing from the service corridor, and I leaned against the door frame and waited. When they could see again, they saw me, standing in a doorway in a work jacket and boots, holding a torque wrench in one hand and a work light in the other, watching them with the patience of someone who has been watching a current schedule all day and has time. The lead figure said in clipped compact standard, "Compact civil inspection, stand aside." I said, "Compact civil inspections are filed in advance with the household coordinator and the building permit registry. What is your inspection number?" He said, "We do not answer to contract labor, stand aside." I said, "You entered a private residential building through the service access at the second hour after midnight with a code device. That is not a civil inspection. I do not know what it is, but I know what it is not. The resident household has been notified of this entrance. I have a recorded line to the Corridor Authority Welfare Office that has been active since I observed you approaching from the service window. Everything you have said in this corridor is on the record." This was true. The work light carried a standard compact civil site recording function, which I had activated before they came through the door. Site recording is a routine safety function on restoration jobs. I use it every day. I had simply left it running and open on the remote record channel, which routes to the Corridor Authority server automatically. This is not a complicated thing to do. It is a standard function. I had simply remembered to use it. The lead figure looked at me for a long moment. He looked at the 4 people behind him. He looked at the corridor ahead, which ran to the residential wing where the locked door, the old physical lock, stood between him and whatever he had come to do. He said, "Move." I said, "No." He said, "You are one person." I said, "Yes." There was a pause. He looked at me again. I think what he was doing was recalculating. He had presumably expected a domestic corridor in a house with no particular physical staff overnight. He had not expected a civil contractor who had been pouring structural composite and operating a hydraulic drill for a week in a space that was now arranged, accidentally but accurately, so that the only way to the residential wing ran through a doorway that I was standing in. He took a step forward. I did not move. He stopped. The thing about a doorway is that it is a fixed piece of geometry. The thing about a door frame is that it has a specific width. The thing about me in a door frame, in work boots and a jacket, with a work light in one hand and a torque wrench in the other, is that I have spent 30 years occupying physical spaces with the specific intention of not being moved out of them by structural loads. A structural load does not care how you feel about it. A structural load simply presses, and you either hold or you do not. I hold. He took another step. I let him get close enough to understand what the geometry meant, and then I said, quietly, "The recording is live. The corridor authority contact is open. Your 5 faces have been on file for the last 6 minutes. I have no ability to prevent you from pushing past me if you choose to. I am one person with no weapons and no training. But you will be doing it on a live record, and whatever you came here to do, you will be doing it with the Corridor Authority Welfare Response Team already in transit." The last part was not technically confirmed. I had opened the record line. The Corridor Authority's response protocols for an active welfare flag on a live record line typically involved a response team, but I did not know how long that would take or whether the team was already moving. I said it because it was the logical consequence of the recorded flag, and because the lead figure was doing the same kind of calculation I was doing, and his calculation needed a piece of information that I could credibly supply. He stood there for 4 seconds. He said to the people behind him, in a language I did not recognize, "Leave it." They left, back through the service entrance, back out into the night, the door swinging shut behind them. I stayed in the doorway for another 10 minutes, because leaving a doorway before the threat is confirmed gone is poor site practice. Then I recorded the exit times in the site log, noted the event in the welfare record channel, confirmed the Corridor Authority had received the flag and had a response team en route, and went and sat back down at the work table. I did not sleep especially well after that, but the composite pour was at 7 in the morning and the cure window was specific, and I have never missed a cure window in 30 years. The Corridor Authority team arrived at 6:15. 4 officers, very professional, who took the site record and walked the service corridor and made their own notes. They told me the welfare flag had been received and processed, and that the household would be contacted through formal channels. They asked if I needed anything. I said I needed them to clear the service entrance area so I could start the composite pour on schedule, because the morning temperature window was closing. They cleared the area. I poured the composite. Sen and Vale came to the terrace at 7:30, which was later than usual. They stood at the colonnade's edge and watched me working the pour. Neither of them said anything for some time. Then Vale said, "Sarth told us what happened." I said, "It is in the record. The Corridor Authority will manage the formal follow-up." She said, "You were alone in the corridor with 5 of them." I said, "Yes." She said, "And you held them." I said, "I stood in a doorway and I made a correct statement about their legal exposure. The doorway held them. I just occupied it." She said, "You stood in a doorway against 5 people because Sen told you they might come." I said, "You have been coming to watch the work every morning for a week and asking good questions about load-bearing structures. It seemed reasonable to make sure there would still be a load-bearing structure to ask about." There was a silence that went on long enough for the pour to reach its next stage. I worked through it. The composite has its own schedule. Sen said eventually, "My father returns tomorrow, not in 4 days. We received a message last night after. He was already on his way." I said, "Good. I will have the south base section poured and sealed by the time he arrives. He will be able to see the new footing." She said, he will want to meet you. I said, I am the restoration contractor. He is the household principal. That is a standard meeting on any project. She said, Kale Voss. I said, yes. She said, I think you know that is not what I mean. I kept working the pour. After a moment I said, Sareth's coordinator confirmed the inauthentic documentation the visitors used last time. What was in the documentation? Sen said, a guardianship transfer application under an old house provision, filed without our father's knowledge. I said, a transfer of whom? A pause. Vale said very quietly, us. I did not stop the pour because the pour does not stop. I kept the paddle moving, kept the spread even, kept the level with the gauge. I said, to whom? Sen said, the applicant is a commercial entity registered in the outer belt. We could not find what they do. I said, commercial entities registered in the outer belt that file guardianship transfers for household daughters in their early adult years and send 5 people through service entrances at 2 in the morning do not have complicated business models. Vale said no. I said, your father's return. Sen said, tomorrow. I said, and the corridor authority welfare flag. Sen said, they confirmed the file this morning. It will trigger a hold on the guardianship application automatically while the welfare investigation is pending. I said, how long is the hold? She said 90 days. The application cannot be processed, amended, or transferred during a welfare investigation hold. I said, then you have 90 days and your father home tomorrow. She said, yes. I worked the pour to its completion. I set the level pegs and covered the section with the cure sheet and weighted the edges. I cleaned the paddle. I noted the pour time and ambient temperature in the site log. Then I stood up and looked at both of them. They were looking back at me with the full attention Verith expression. Both daughters, both eyelids engaged, both very still. I said, I am a construction contractor. I pour composite bases and I set structural frames. I hold load paths in place while the permanent material sets. That is what I do. Vale said, you held our load path last night. I said, someone needed to stand in a doorway. I was the only one there. She said, you did not have to be there. I said, I was already there. I had moved my kit to the anteroom the day before. It seemed like the right place to be. Sen said, because we told you. I said, because you came out every morning at 5:30 and asked good questions about work I was doing in your house. That is worth something. Sen looked at Vale. Vale looked at me. She said, my grandfather's key is still in your pocket. I said, I will return it. She said, I know, I'm not asking for it. I did not entirely understand what she meant by that. But the composite needed its cure time undisturbed, and there was a second pour scheduled for the afternoon, and the lintel realignment was still 2 days out, and I had a schedule to maintain. I said, I will be here until the job is finished. Sen said 22 days. I said, closer to 21 now. Vale said, and after? I said, after, I will have a signed completion certificate and a bill for civil restoration services, and you will have a properly seated colonnade. That is the arrangement. She said, yes. She sat down on the edge of the terrace wall, not alarmed, not arranging herself formally, just sitting, the way you sit when the weight has been somewhere else for a long time and has just moved to where it belongs. Her sister sat beside her. They sat in the morning light with the cure sheet settled over the new footing and the shoring jacks still standing and the old house stone all around them, and they were quiet. I cleaned the remaining composite from the poor tools and set them to drain. The house Verith principal arrived the following afternoon. He was a tall Verith man of perhaps 60, with the same pale gold coloring as his daughters and the particular manner of someone who has spent a long time being responsible for things and has made their peace with it. He came to the colonnade site with Sareth at his side, and stood for a moment looking at the new footing, the south base section poured and sealed and sitting clean in the old stone. And then he looked at the shoring assembly, and the equipment pod, and the restoration schedule I had pinned to the frame. He said in compact standard, the south footing. I said, poured yesterday morning. Full cure will complete in approximately 40 hours. I will assess and remove the shoring assembly on day 15. He said, the fracture propagation the original order described. I said, worse than the photograph suggested. The horizontal seam ran deeper. I shored the section for 2 days before beginning removal to make sure there was no further stress damage to the adjacent material. He looked at the new footing for another moment. He said, you also stood in a doorway. I said, that was the same evening as the south pour, yes. He said, with 5 of them. I said, I had the recording line active and the corridor authority flag filed. The physical element was relatively straightforward. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at Sareth, and Sareth looked at the ground in the way of someone carefully maintaining a professional expression. He said, my daughters tell me you held a doorway against 5 people with a work light and a torque wrench. I said, the torque wrench was incidental. He said, they also tell me you moved your overnight kit to the anteroom the previous day, specifically because Sen had told you the visitors might return. I said, the anteroom has a good window on the service approach. He said, Kale Voss. I said, yes. He said, do you know what the transfer application would have meant? I said, I know what it was. I know what commercial entities of that kind do. He said, then you know. I said, yes. He stood and looked at the new footing for a long time. Then he said, you came here to restore a colonnade. I said, I came here to restore a colonnade. He said, and you restored the colonnade. I said, I am in the process of it. 14 days remaining approximately. He said 14 days. He looked at the shoring frame, at the jack heads, at the torque indicators. The same things his younger daughter had been noting in her notebook 10 days earlier. He said, Sen said you taught her about load transfer. I said she asked questions. I answered them. He said, she has been drawing load path diagrams since she was 12. Her grandfather built this wing. I said, she told me. She said he understood that the point was not to avoid the weight but to know where it was going. He looked at me. He said, he told me that when I was very young. I did not fully understand it until much later. I said, that is usually how it goes with structural principles. He made a sound that was the Verith version of something between acknowledgement and reluctant humor. He said, you will stay the 14 days. I said, I have a contract. He said, and when the contract is complete. I said, I will have a completion certificate, and you will have a restored colonnade with a standard compact structural composite base, correctly graded, fully cured, and carrying the full column load without stress fracture. He said, and my daughters will have the habit of coming to the colonnade at 5:30 in the morning. I said, I suspect that is not my responsibility. He said, no, but it is something. He extended his hand, which is a human gesture, and held it out toward me in the careful, deliberate way of someone who has learned the gesture specifically and uses it to mean something precise. I shook it. His hand was the hand of someone who had also worked with them, once, a long time ago. He said, thank you, Kale Voss. I said, I am a restoration contractor. I restore what is damaged. It is what I do. He held my hand for a moment before releasing it and said, yes, I can see that. He left with Sareth. I turned back to the colonnade and picked up the assessment probe for the morning's inspection of the north base section. The cure was running on schedule. The load paths were holding. The morning was calm and clear, and the pale light came off the gas giant on the horizon and lay across the old stone in the particular way it did at this hour, not warm exactly, but clarifying. I have stood in a lot of doorways in 30 years. Most of them have been load-bearing ones, where the question is whether the temporary structure I have built will hold the weight of the permanent material above it while I work. The answer is always the same. You build the shoring correctly, you set the jacks in the right places, you read the load path and you put the material where the weight is going, and then you hold the position while the permanent thing sets. That is the whole of the work, really. You hold the position while the permanent thing sets. Vale came around the corner of the colonnade at 5:30 the next morning, alone, with a notebook and a stylus and one of the small morning cups. She stopped when she saw me already at the north base section with the assessment probe. She said, "I thought you might have moved on." I said, "I have 14 days remaining." She said, "Yes, but I thought you might have moved on." I said, "I have not." She sat down on the edge of the shoring frame in the place she always sat and opened the notebook to a page covered in small, neat diagrams. She said, "I have been working on the load calculation for the lintel realignment. The one you said was 2 days out." I said, "Let me see." She showed me the notebook. The calculation was mostly correct. She had made one error in the distribution assumption, a common error, one that underestimates the cantilever effect at the lintel's outer third. I showed her where it was and how to correct it. She wrote the correction in a different color. She said, "Why does the outer third behave differently?" I said, "Because the load is not distributed evenly across the lintel. It concentrates toward the unsupported end." She said, "The part with nothing beneath it." I said, "Yes." She looked at the diagram. She said, "So you have to account for where the weight goes when there is nothing to receive it." I said, "You have to account for it in the shoring. You build support for the part that has nothing. Then you work the part that has something, and the support holds the unsupported part until the permanent connection is made." She was quiet for a moment. She said, without looking up from the notebook, "That is what you did in the corridor." I said, "It is the same principle." She said, "You built support for the part that had nothing." I said, "Temporarily, until something permanent could be put in place." She said, "My father." I said, "Your father, the corridor authority welfare hold, the formal investigation. Those are the permanent things." She wrote something else in the notebook, not a diagram this time. I did not look at what it was. The morning light was coming clear off the plateau and the north base section was looking good and I had work to do. She said, after a while, "Sen says you will probably take another job on this moon after ours is complete." I said, "There is a bridge footing restoration at the North Transit Junction. I have been considering the bid." She said, "The North Transit Junction is 40 minutes from here by ground." I said, "Yes." She said, 40 minutes is not far." I said, "No." She wrote one more thing in the notebook and closed it. She picked up her morning cup and sat for a while in the light, and I worked the probe through the north section's assessment points, and the colonnade stood around us in the old stone that her grandfather had built, holding its load the way it had held it for 3 generations, patient and quiet and strong enough. That is the other thing about structure. It does not announce itself. It does not require acknowledgement. It simply holds what it has agreed to hold for as long as the material will bear it. 30 years, every morning the same as this one. I kept working.